Brought to you by Exabeam, I'm Steve Moore, and this is the new CISO. Good morning, Eric. Thank you so much for joining. For the uninitiated, as I always say, Eric, who are you and what do you do?
It's certainly, Steve. It's good to be here on the new CISO podcast. I'm Eric O'Neill. I am a former FBI undercover operative. My job was counterintelligence and counterterrorism, mostly in and around Washington, D.C., where I still live. My claim to fame, of course, is going undercover in the most unique case I think the FBI has ever run, in FBI headquarters to catch an individual who turned out to be the most damaging spy in FBI's history and quite possibly American history, Robert Hanssen. I went undercover in FBI headquarters, was able to find the smoking gun that led to his arrest and conviction. He pled guilty. And after that, I became an attorney, started a few companies, one that does competitive intelligence investigations and another, brand new, called NeXasure. That is a cybersecurity advisory and technology company. I'm also the best-selling author of 2 books, Gray Day, which is my story of going undercover to catch Hanssen, and my brand new book that just came out, Spies, Lies, and Cybercrime, which is everything you need to know in a really fun true crime storytelling setting to tackle this often dizzying world of cybercrime, scams and attackers that are coming after our data and stealing our pocketbooks and enrolling into the dark web to fund themselves.
Which of the 2 books, a little bit of a random question to start off, which of the 2 books did you enjoy creating the most? Because it's a ton of effort. Obviously, they have a very different focus and a different mission, maybe even a slightly different audience, but both very important. Which did you, was it, as you went through the process, was it, were you like, I'm really glad I did that? Or do you get to the point where you're sort of cursing yourself at some point where you're like, this is more work than I thought?
Well, both of my books were joys to write. Gray Day was always in my mind. It was that story that I've told so many times on stage, the story of catching Hanssen with a twist. I waited many, many years to write the book. The book came out in 2019. We caught Hanssen in 2001. But the reason was I wanted more than just the story. So Gray Day is sort of a Frankenstein's monster that worked. It's the first-person story from behind my eyes of being in the middle of that intense investigation in the FBI, but also an analysis of the evolution of espionage from the old cloak and dagger, dead drops and signal sites and shadowy meets and train stations of the past to the cyber espionage that occurs today, and why everything changed and how it changed us. Spies, Lies, and Cybercrime just takes it to the next conclusion, that cybercrime, which is the fastest growing business on earth, is just traditional espionage repackaged for cyber criminals, and the fact that cyber criminals and these large gangs, using the dark web and the anonymity of the dark web and internet, are launching these same traditional espionage attacks, just using computers to do it and fooling us. So what I did is I took this idea of the evolution of espionage and carried it forward into the evolution of cybercrime. And the way that I write is the same way that I tell stories on stage. I think that you have to learn and you remember and you retain information through stories, not through PowerPoint or bullet points or just regurgitation of information. So I wrote a cybersecurity book that actually reads like a spy thriller, or actually 2 of them. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that people pick it up. And my goal is, read my books, learn, and make yourself safe from a lot of these cyber attacks. And if enough people don't get scammed, then we can dry up the dark web, and that's really the only way to stop cybercrime.
It's a pretty deep. You mentioned dry up. It's a pretty deep lake.
It is immense right now, by many different statistics and a lot of analysis by people that are way smarter than me, just the cost of cybercrime that moves through the dark web. So remember, the dark web is like a marketplace of connected servers using particular technology that law enforcement has beat its head against to try to shut down for a long time. And it's impossible. It's not just impracticable. It's impossible to shut down the dark web just because of how it's engineered and designed. And it's a marketplace for anything. I have a good friend who I take you over my shoulder in a chapter of the book to dive as deep down in the dark web as we can into some of the most depraved places, and he calls it depravity at the touch of a button. And as we're going down into the dark web, his virtual machine, his VM on his computer just crashes and crashes. He keeps having to reinstall Windows and reinstall Windows because it's dangerous to go down there. But just to show some of the things down there, it's the biggest weapons marketplace on earth. You can buy any kind of gun you want or weapon. It's the biggest drug trade on earth, and they will ship you your drug of choice. Well, maybe they'll ship it, maybe they won't. You take that risk. They're bad guys, they're criminals. In coffee cans, so the dogs don't sniff it. But it's also the biggest human trafficking marketplace on earth. Some of the most terrible things that I've ever seen in the depths, the deepest depths of the dark web. But taking that all aside, which is a lot of money flowing through, just cybercrime, ransomware attacks, cyber criminals, attackers for hire, full e-learning platforms for people who want to get into ransomware. Ransomware as a service. So the biggest ransomware groups, right? These what I call criminal syndicates, actually published all of their material, their attacks, their techniques, their tools. They'll train you, give know-how, and they have these affiliates who are other criminal groups who want to get in and take all their tools and launch ransomware attacks and just kick 25% up to the mothership. I mean, it's a massive business. All of that, right, is over $12 trillion a year. And by GDP, that would make the dark web the third largest economy on Earth. If it was a country, it would be bigger than Germany and Japan put together. And nipping at the heels right now of China. The extraordinary growth I've predicted that in the next few years, it could rise to $20 trillion in GDP, call it gross domestic product, of evil cybercrime.
It's pretty fascinating when you begin to unpack just that. And I find that a lot of leaders, and I'm talking kind of above the CISO, so above the individual that's responsible for the security, privacy, integrity, confidentiality of an organization, sometimes don't quite get it. There's this cybercrime mechanism. There's certainly incentive for the bad folks to try to collect, but they often see their organization as not immune, but kind of like, yeah, that's not going to happen to me. Right. This is kind of a couple levels above. Why would they be interested in me? Or that's probably not going to happen, or that's going to happen to somebody else. The size is over the top, right? And the success, the reason why it's so big is because that enterprise, the marketplace is just the marketplace, but the actions work. People are able to cash out, to attack and cash out. Now, there's many ways people are making money, as you well noted, selling drugs, trafficking people. But a lot of what I come across is whether someone's getting ransomed, these types of scenarios. What do you, for someone who has not read the book or your books, what do you use as a educational tool to convince the CEO or the board that, hey, like you're at bigger risk here than you might realize? Is there a vehicle that you use or a story that you use to kind of hook them in on that topic?
Yeah, there are a number of stories, and you're hitting on a really important point. I mean, first of all, it all comes down to budget. With an unlimited budget, you can get pretty close to making yourself safe. You're never 100% safe from a cyber attack. But what we try to do now in cybersecurity is assume the attacker will get in because they are that clever, and catch them as fast as we can. That's where we're moving technology. That's where we're moving training. That's where we're moving all of our cybersecurity tactics. It's threat hunting now. It's not perimeter defense. But the great Achilles heel is when an organization says it probably won't happen to me. And, I start the book with a fire, talking about a story of how when I was a freshman in high school, my home burned down. And I was pulled out of school, in the middle of the day and driven home by a friend, a family friend, and their parents came and picked me up. Nobody told me what was going on. They dropped me off in my driveway, and there were fire trucks everywhere. They had to call them in from other counties, and spraying water at the house, and it was a smoking wreck. And I looked, and it was my room that was the most damaged room in the house, because this is an old Victorian home. once upon a time, they used to have a fireplace in every room. And then with technology, they had these things. They decided instead of having a fireplace in every room, we'll just build one big one in the basement, right? And then we'll have these ducts that would go up into what used to be fireplaces, and they put these iron grates, and the grates would heat in every room. This is like really modern technology for like 1890, right? And then, they invented steam and boilers and radiators, and they got rid of all the fireplaces and turned them into closets, except they forgot to pull the vent out of my room, which was behind my closet. So apparently, it was a good thing I was at school, a fireball went up from the basement where the fire started and just exploded my entire room. So everything's gone. Everything I owned before my freshman year in high school was evaporated in a second. And standing there looking at the smoking ruin of my room is what it feels like to be the center of a ransomware attack, especially where they don't only encrypt your data, they destroy it. They absolutely destroy it. And bad guys know, and there's so many bad guys out there. There's somebody who's going to come after you. Bad guys know that the most important thing you have is your data in a company. I mean, it's your employees, sure, it's your workforce, but then it's your data. But that's your intellectual property. That's the electrons that drive everything you do. It's your finances. It's all your policies and procedures. It moves all of your information. It's how your workforce communicates. It's how you do what you do is data. And they know that that data is the most critical thing for you. So they don't care who you are, and they don't care what you do, and they don't care how important you think you are, or whether you work for a defense contractor or you work for the federal government. All they care is whether you're vulnerable. And if you're vulnerable, you will be attacked, because they know that if they can steal that data, lock that data, ransom that data, they can put you in pressure to pay. And that's all they want to do is make money, just make money. So for a CISO, the worst thing you can say is, I think this is good enough, right? For the executives over the CISO, where that tension is for budget, right? Because a CISO is a vice president, right? Who usually has a line to the board, and the board needs to take more responsibility over cybersecurity. But every vice president in a company is fighting for budget, but that budget for cyber today is absolutely critical. So what I do, I speak to boards. I do workshops with boards. I do workshops with C-suites. And I tell them the stories. I tell them stories about these attacks. I tell them the story about when I was consulting with a huge multinational NGO, which is the through story in the book. This ransomware attack that I find myself in the center of, and that's my first person story throughout the book that carries you through the whole book. I always feel like you have to have one story that brings your reader through the book. And, I talk about what it feels like to be in that fire. And when you're in the fire, that is the worst time ever to now be investing in cybersecurity. Because just the numbers, it costs 10x as much to remediate, to build, to examine your cybersecurity when you're in the middle of an attack than the very cheap vulnerability assessment that my company conducts that you can do when things are chill, when things are calm, when there is no fire. And so what I say is, don't wait till a pressure situation forces you to examine your cybersecurity. Do it now, when you have the time and the patience, and it's going to cost way less than if we have to come in the middle of an attack and find the attacker, kick them out, figure out how they got in. Now we have to figure out, what did they steal? What did they access? What disclosure do you have to do?
It's an interesting. You say 10x, and I would push back on that. I think it's even more than that. Because not only is there waste, but it's one of the things I often say is, and those that listen to the show will smile because I say it often. You also never want to make an introduction during a crisis, and in your past life, you're probably doing, in present life, probably doing a lot of that. Meaning, you're getting thrust into a sensitive situation, meeting new people while everybody's upset,
right,
or stressed, or hasn't slept, or all the above. And it's that whole remediation event that you describe, and the other sort of social element of this. And there's so many things I take notes as you're speaking, right, of things I want to go back to. But the thing that people don't realize is I don't want to call it psychological toll, but Going through a breach is both amazing and terrible, meaning you're going to learn a lot really fast.
Right.
But the folks I speak with, about half of them either probably aren't going to be with the company, either by their choosing or someone else's choosing. And it makes an indelible mark because most people think, oh, a breach lasts how long? A month? You know, I've seen them go, and you know where this is going. That doesn't include things like the full remediation and additional audit scrutiny and all the things, you know, all the things that are sort of the long tail of the real problem.
Exactly. The immense amount of legal work that goes into it. You know, I'm also an attorney. I've been a general counsel for organizations, and you know, there's an immense amount of legal work that's very expensive. Those data privacy attorneys are pricey. There's the reputational damage. You know, how do you handle that fallout? What disclosures do you have to make? Like every year there are new regulations, statewide and federal, about what you have to disclose, when you have to disclose. You can't try to hide it anymore. And of course, you know, the work that you should have done in the beginning. You know, I start the book with a story about, you know, this story about the NGO that got hit, and it starts with a call on a Sunday, which is, you know, interesting because Gray Day starts with a call on a Sunday. Gray Day's first line is "Phones should not ring on Sunday mornings." And then in my second book, just it's the same way it worked. I get woken up on a Saturday, and it's the CISO from this company. It's not really a CISO, right? He was the IT guy who, in this small company, you know, smallish company, was just, you're the CISO, right? You know, which isn't fair, and so many organizations do that, and that's it's a mistake. Yeah, I mean, it just is, because you're taking someone who has IT experience, and they're very good at the IT side and the operations side, but don't have the security experience that is very particular to a CISO. And one of the reasons organizations do it is because they want to save that budget. And this guy calls me, a great guy calls me, and he says, "I think we have a problem." And you never want to hear that from the head of IT, right? Right. And I asked him, we talked, and we made the command decision right there on the phone that what we were going to do, because there was no plan, right? We were starting the vulnerability assessment. We hadn't gotten through there yet. What we were going to do is have everybody, the 3,000 employees, shut their laptops, pull the Ethernet cord, log off Wi-Fi, and walk away. And then everybody had to communicate through like WhatsApp and text, because we didn't know where the attacker had gone. We had no context into how they'd gotten in, and you know, systems across countries were falling. Yeah. Because he had gotten into VPN connections that weren't secured. And it generated this massive, vulnerability assessment in the fire, and that's where it's like 10 times more expensive than if you just get, you know, a quick one ahead of the problem. So yeah, you never want to hear that from CISO. And just to put a pin in that point, you know, those vulnerability assessments are just so critical. And if you're small and you just can't afford the $250,000 to like $350,000 salary for a good CISO, then, you know, you go get a fractional one. Go get a vCISO. You know, somebody who can come in and be in it with your staff and understand the very particular pressure points to your organization, how you work, where you are, what the actual risk is. This is what we do when we do a really good vulnerability assessment, and can be there to help you answer those questions at, you know, like $300 an hour, not, you know, this immense salary with benefits.
Well, at least for those, you know, it's tough for some companies even to get to the point where they know how to even justify they don't know enough to know that they need that in many cases. Right. And they wait for the crisis. But to your point, having someone to come in and outline a plan and say, hey, here's a force rank of your problems. You know, you mentioned bad account control, bad credential management, bad VPN management, you know, so remote access without some sort of adaptive authentication, you know, misuse of credentials. We see that all the time. You know, the inability to identify if a credential is being misused or is compromised is very common. Setting things, maybe they even have multi-factor authentication, but it's somehow set in a static way, meaning they have multi-factor, but they're only using one factor.
Well, we see that, it's amazing doing vulnerability assessments. We see one of the number one things we see, especially with SMB, small and medium businesses, where my company really focuses because it's so underserved, is they don't have multi-factor or two-factor turned on anywhere. Or in fact, they had it and there's a policy, but they turned it off for convenience. Because employees complained, and IT, the IT person is looking for the easiest path of least resistance, and okay, I'll disable it, right? And then that is the number one point of attack, because now your impersonation scheme, your AI op, your attack only has to get a password, and man, that is a big point of failure for any organization.
Well, tying back to your criminal marketplace, so there's, as everyone, most of the folks I think that listen to the show, and certainly yourself understand, there's a whole ecosystem, and you began to hit on that earlier, where there's folks who are just focusing on initial access and finding ways to get access to systems and harvesting credentials, and then those get repackaged and resold to other people for other means to sort of cash in or try to go on to the next phase. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. Within these, that people often will say dark web, which sounds sexier, but these marketplaces, these criminal marketplaces, are pretty interesting in that regard. Is that there's these subgroups, and then there's, as you mentioned, also there's a help desk of sorts, and there's a kind of a multi-level marketing element to it, where there's the repackaging and reselling, and you mentioned that as a service, and then so there's a lot of really interesting things there, but people don't realize at scale that information about your company is being collected, organized, and packaged, and being offered, and it has a juiciness level to it, right? And there's do I have system access? Do I have good passwords? Do I have, right? And there may be some tests done. And so everybody is getting vacuumed into this. Now, other decisions are getting made on, how do we hit this, or who, the prioritization is a little different. Obviously, larger companies are going to get a higher priority, but everybody is vulnerable.
Right.
And so there's someone out there who wants to attack you. And if there's anything out there about you, it's going to get picked up. I worked in an issue recently where even a company that had multi-factor authentication and had good process, they went and harvested LinkedIn and found sysadmins.
Yes.
And then found out their password reset process, and then realized it was the last four of their SSN. And then bought information about these individuals in a criminal marketplace to have that information. And then used that when interacting with a help desk, because that's the challenge and response. So you see how complex this gets. And that was not espionage, that was criminal.
Well, that's very similar to one of the stories that I detail in the book is the attack on MGM, which happened a number of years ago, a few years ago now. And it was incredibly clever. And there it is a very sophisticated ransomware attack group called ALF5, which is a Russian cybercrime group. And they're affiliates. So they had this affiliate group called Scattered Spider, who are known for being incredibly good at social engineering. They're the modern equivalent of the prank call kids, right, from when we grew up in the 80s. And they are very adept at phone impersonation attacks. And what they did is, after doing some research with Al5 to determine the identities of the systems admins for MGM, the MGM apparently, Grand is not the only big hotel casino that's owned by MGM in Vegas. They own like half the casinos. I didn't realize that until I was researching the case, including the Cosmo, which is my favorite because, it's the James Bond hotel there. So that's where I like to speak. And they with a 10-minute phone call to the IT help desk, they were able to completely impersonate this systems admin. They knew enough about him and his background to answer all the challenge questions, to get his they figured out his username was just like, the email address, right? And then they got them to reset his password and his two-factor authentication to a different phone, like they controlled, right? And that's how they got in. 10-minute phone call, and then Scattered Spider hands it over to Al5, who are very adept at quietly infiltrating and moving laterally and compromising systems until they were able to bring everything down to the point where in these major hotels, you couldn't use a slot machine. You couldn't make a reservation to eat. You couldn't make a reservation to go see a show. So you can't gamble. You can't see a show. You can't go get anything to eat. You couldn't get in your room. Like, what do you do in Vegas, right? There's other things, but not me, right? And so it was absolute chaos to the point where, this story blew my mind. The hotels were taking these cases, of water, these big, huge, like 24 packs of water, and putting them in their elevators because they were afraid like people would get in the elevator and head up to like the 42nd floor and get stuck between 40 and 41. And who knows when they would be able to get them out because all the systems were going haywire. Wow. They never paid. And that's another thing. Like, do you pay? Here's the thing. Here's what I tell clients. You can pay, and we're talking to them on the dark web. You might get your data back quickly, or you get the keys, you'll get things decrypted, you'll be able to get up and running. And it's really, right now, the calculation is it going to get my operations up fast enough that it's worth the cost of paying this, right? When we're looking at that delta, is the price to pay the bad guys to get operations going worth that cost? Am I going to make more by moving operations forward than I'm going to pay them? Because, you have to say, they have your data, and regardless of what they say, they're going to sell your data. They're going to sell all the tactics and techniques that they use to get in and attack you. They're going to sell that. And you will be a repeat customer. They're not going to destroy your data. They're going to lie to you. And so you still have to take all the steps that you would take if you didn't pay them to make sure that they're out, make sure that they can't get back in, find out how they got in, and make sure you close that door. Change all your policies and procedures to rebuild cybersecurity and your architecture from the ground up to make sure you're not going to be hit again, because there will be any number of other groups that now have bought the precise way that they got in, and everything they left behind, right? Because they leave all sorts of little open doors, and then they sell that to other attackers, and they're going to be trying to get you again. So just paying a ransom doesn't mean you're out of the fire. That just is a kind of expedient way to get your operations up and running, but you still have to do every little bit of work that you were going to have to do anyway, and you should have done before you got attacked.
So you bring up a lot of really good points there, and I want to unpack a little bit of that. One is, should I pay or should I not? That is a very controversial thing, right? There's even legal guidance on this that's out there at a federal level, in fact, and right. Paying sometimes. If somebody's on the OFAC list, that's a whole nother thing.
If they're on the OFAC list, you can't pay. Yeah, right.
That's it for those that. So, Office of Foreign Asset Control. If there's somebody, if it's headed to a country where, we have that sort of government filter, and you do that, I believe, and you're the lawyer, I think that's technically a felony. Yeah,
you can get a lot of trouble. You can get fined. It's a serious federal fine. And what in this case that I highlight in my book, the NGO, non-governmental organization, which is a charity, global charity, was a government contractor, and so they are required to follow all the Treasury rules and OFAC. And the group Lockbit was a sanctioned cyber attack group and out of Russia, and so they couldn't pay.
Right.
They couldn't pay. We stalled. We messed with them. I need another week. We got to pull the money together, and they sent us the insurance policy. Is saying, well, here's your cyber insurance policy. We know you can get this much money, because they grabbed it. That's one of the first things they look at for when they're in your environment. But you're right. If it's sanctioned and those OFAC rules apply to you, you cannot pay. And the FBI says don't pay.
Right.
Right. The FBI, their guidance is you should never pay. And why? For all the reasons I said. I mean, if you pay, you still need to do all the work anyway. But also, every time someone pays, that encourages more cybercrime. More individuals might think, hey, everybody's getting money, like I could do this too, right? And so instead of getting a real job, they go become bad guys. They become cyber criminals, the new mafia, right?
100%.
But in my book, I distinguish, like even though I come from the FBI and I usually go march and sing with them, I disagree. Whether or not you pay really depends on your circumstances. And like I said, if it's an operational decision and you're bleeding enormous amounts of money every day that you're down, and you're not going to get up from under it for a long time because you didn't do all the work ahead of the attack, then sometimes you pay in order to get things unlocked and get the factory working, right? Get things moving and start making, bring that income in, while you're doing all the work to find out how they got in. And yeah, so it's that calculus is a very, very difficult one. Attorneys get very involved. Your cybersecurity insurance gets very involved there because they could be on the hook for what you pay depending on your policy. And unfortunately, what happens usually after one of these attacks is until you show that you've hit a new gold standard in cybersecurity, your endorsement for cyber attacks under your insurance policy is gonna jump up.
Many things, yes. So that's I want to go there here in a little bit. But you mentioned earlier, I want to go back to a couple points. So there was the pay versus not pay. I know of some groups that it's not really it is a cyber problem, but I will say this as a blanket statement that's generally true. Most organizations are really bad at any kind of recovery because they don't practice it in a way that's meaningful. Meaning, if I come in and we say, hey, we need to restore operations, they've sort of done it in a make-believe land. So let's say we don't want to pay, but we need to restore operations. Well, the reality is most companies have never actually tested that.
Yes, exactly.
In full. And the other fact is most companies, and this is world around, now have a global role, they don't know what is even out there. They don't have a good asset list. So I've never practiced what to restore, and I don't know what I own.
Yes.
And now I'm in the middle of a crisis, and operations down, adversary is in, adversary has backdoors, weaknesses still exist. There's all these work streams. So it's not a one thing as you outlined. It's many things, as you said. And so that's the piece that most don't understand. So there's pressure to return to making money, obviously, but then it's identify where's the adversary, what did they touch and change, what backdoors did they leave. Having a remediation event, to sort of the story I tell, is it's sort of like if you ever known anyone that maybe had a heart issue and they need to shock the heart back into rhythm. So they chemically stop it, heart stops, there's an arrhythmia, and they shock it back into rhythm, and that's sort of a remediation event. Now, you have to do some planning ahead of time because you need to be able to, you're rotating accounts, you're doing a lot of other things. But all of this stuff, and then it's just, then here's the other funny thing, if you return to the way you were before, that's still not good enough.
Right.
Most people don't understand that.
Right. So yeah, a lot of organizations, what they're doing is they're saying, they're doing some quick work to find out. In the book, I talk about how you need to figure out the how, the where, the why, and the what. Right, all of that information. Like, how did they get in? Where did they go when they got in? What did they steal? Right, and why did they attack you? Are you going to be attacked again? And there are different reasons that you get attacked. Sometimes it's an attack of opportunity. Attackers are using AI. And AI agents now, they're using them to just scan networks and look for a known vulnerability. You forgot to patch this outward-facing server, and the agent comes back to the bad guy sitting God knows where in the world, and says, "Hey, there's a known vulnerability here. They didn't patch this, this server they use for their help desk, or this server they use for this widget or this API, and you can attack this. Hey, their bad guy AI agents are super helpful." And then they launched the attack just because there was an opportunity there. But what organizations will do is they will just look for when, right? That last question, when did they land? Okay, now I know because we can look at logs, we can look at when information was extracted, when they set up a beacon, where the breach, when did they land? That time, and then they go back. Okay, let's go a day before that and just restore from there. And then they restore. Great, we're up and running. We've restored. We've kicked the guy out. We told him the pound sand. We're not going to pay. But whatever flaw that attacker uses is still there, and they come right back, right? Maybe they got to take a week. Maybe they got to take some time. Maybe they got to be a little more careful this time because you're looking, but they'll come right back because you haven't closed that door. You haven't done the work to figure out, when they got in, but you haven't figured out how they got in. And you still, even if you restore, you still have to do the digital forensics to find out where they went, right? What they stole. So it's not just like when they got in, it's where did they go through your data? What data did they access? Because anything they accessed, you then have to assume legally they took it, right? They took it, unless you can prove they didn't. And if you don't have the ability, the visibility and the context in your data, if you don't know, as you said earlier, Steve, where your data is, who has access to that data, where is it in the world and how many different people can touch it, right? Then you can't show whether they stole it or not. And if you can't show whether they stole it or not, but the bad guy moved through that data set, you have to assume it was lost, and now you have a massive disclosure problem on your hands. And that can be very costly because you have to tell people, hi, sorry, customers, we might have lost your data, and we're going to give you some data monitoring for a year. And those customers are going to be really mad, and they will probably move their business elsewhere.
That's it for this episode of the new CISO. Thank you for listening. Check out more episodes on exabeam.com/podcast. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe to get brand new episodes first.